Hi, this is Mike Spivey of the Spivey Consulting Group. It is Monday, January 4th. Happy New Year, everyone. And I wanted to talk about, I think, to me, this is an important concept, which is what are the most commonly misunderstood but important parts of the application process? So let me dive right in. The first is as follows. Admissions is not a vacuous process in the least bit. You are not applying and being read in a vacuum. It is a comparative process. If I were to write, I am writing a book on admissions, but I literally could sit in the Stanley Hotel, if you know the reference to The Shining, and just write the word differentiate, turn the page, differentiate, turn the page, because admissions is always about comparison. Let me give you an example. If Harvard Law School is going to get 7,000 applicants, there's probably 5,000 in that pool. This comes from Karen Buttenbaum, the former director of admissions at Harvard Law School, who I was talking to on the phone. There's probably 5,000 in that pool who they could admit. Of course, they're only admitting 1,000 or 800. So they are making very difficult comparative judgment calls. And sometimes they're random. I think I've podcasted about this before, but you can't always reverse engineer why one person was admitted and another person wasn't. Sometimes it's because, the application was just as strong as the other person's application, but they were from North Dakota, or they were from Charlottesville, Virginia, and the file reader was from Charlottesville, Virginia. Point being this, you are being compared against everyone for limited numbers of spots. And because you are being compared, you have to differentiate. A classic story that comes to mind about why this is a misunderstanding is every year we will take a couple personal statements and we'll throw them up online. We'll either put them on our website, well, we definitely do that, or we put them on Reddit. And I think once I even put one on my personal blog. It was more like a motivational personal statement. Obviously, we are choosing the personal statements that hit complete home runs, right? Where the applicant was a 155, 3.7 and got into a top 14 school. So, we're picking the personal statements that obviously carried the most weight because we want them to set in, because this is why the applicant punched so far above their numbers. Here's what happens. Understandably so, there will be the following comment. This happens every time, by the way, every time we put up a personal statement. Well, I understand that's well written, and I understand that person has a really interesting background, but I don't see anything in there about why they want to go to that law school or why they want to be a lawyer or their accomplishments. So it doesn't make sense to me that that's a good personal statement. The reason why people on the applicant side who have never been a dean of admissions say that is because they've never had to read 7,000 personal statements in a cycle. The misunderstanding is about the comparative process. They don't understand how important it is to differentiate. I mean, obviously you don't want to write some reverse haiku and try to be overly clever, but you do always want to understand that your application is not being just read by some person in some room and then they're making an admit or deny decision. That person's already read 55 applications that day, and they have the ability to admit 3 people that day. So misunderstanding number 1, admissions is a comparative process. Before I do 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 more, let me also obviously disclaim that not everyone misunderstands these. Some people do everything I'm about to say correctly, not wrongly. It's always fascinating to me. There are people who just instinctively get admissions, and I see them every year. I always put a pin in it and say, I want to find them a job as a dean of admissions at some law school when they graduate law school and then hire them 3 years later. There are people who get admissions. So when I say misconceptions, I just mean that these are topics that I often see people sort of debating about and not knowing the answer. Here's number 2. To me, this is a fascinating one. I think that it's difficult for applicants to understand that admissions people want to get to know applicants. They're generally hired, not because they're these data geniuses, some are, not because they can, strategize better than the next school, but they're hired because they are charismatic, outgoing, extroverted, charming people. The typical dean hire for a dean of admissions is who comes into the room and charms me for an hour. Now, I could argue that that's not the right way to hire a dean of admissions, and I could argue that there's some deans of admissions out there that have very little charm but are very good at their job. But the point is, most of these people are extroverted, outgoing people who want to like you. So let them like you. You are certainly able to get to know on a personal level. I don't mean like their Facebook page or sitting in their parking garage, dear God, no. But I do mean that you can call admissions offices. You can introduce yourself. Post-COVID, which hopefully will occur April, so you'll still have time if you're on wait lists, you can visit schools. I had a client who got into Cornell and she visited 3 times. Now, this is a really fine line because 3 times for some people would be too many. You have to sort of know your own EQ, and most people probably don't have the best understanding of their own EQ. A great book to read, by the way, would be Dale Carnegie's, still one of the most popular books, How to Make Friends and Influence People. That book is basically about how to ask people about themselves and get them talking about themselves. If you can get an admissions officer talking about their school, talking about themselves, they are going to get off the phone, get off the Zoom, get out of the meeting with a feeling of, I like this person, I want to admit them. Let me get more personal. I literally can't even count the number of times in my career I admitted someone because I liked them. It doesn't happen at the early stages of the cycle, because at the early stages of the cycle, you're more data-centric. But in the summer, you would much rather have that person you relate to who's likable, who you got to know, than some random stranger. It's even more simple. Come summer, you have a waitlist need and you remember the person that was in your office 3 days ago and they were likable and there was no red flags in their application and boom, they get admitted. The misconception number 2 is that, it's not the office of denial. It's the office of admissions. And while you can't talk yourself into the law school, there are many opportunities certainly to get to know the law school and get to know the admissions officers. The third misconception, I guess it's not necessarily a misconception. I just don't think law school applicants, rightfully so, ever sit around and think about this, is how do law schools make money? And the answer is basically just from students, from you. Now, it's not just you, a JD applicant. In the last 5 years, there's been a tremendous uptick in non-JD programs, Masters of Law, LLM programs, online programs, etc. These programs are essentially to generate money. Now, a law school dean would turn that back around on me and say, no, we're educating people in different ways, and maybe they're right. It doesn't matter. The bottom line is law schools make money off of you, off of students, off of revenue. The only other way they make money is from gifts, and gifts to law schools are much, much, much more rare than gifts to undergraduate. Just think about it. 10 years from now, when your alma maters start calling you, and they will, are you going to give to your undergrad or are you going to give to the law school? 19 out of every 20 people at least are going to give to their undergrad school. There's a couple things about this notion that are possibly the most important part of the podcast. Law schools weren't making money since the Great Recession, and they were still involved in the rankings game. So the way they were getting money to give out scholarships was from central universities. Their central universities were floating them money, and then they could remiss tuition, which is a much better word than scholarship, because scholarship isn't really free money, and this should help you in scholarship negotiation. If X law school cuts their tuition from $45,000 to $25,000, you're still paying them $25,000 a year. So the notion of scholarship to me is a little bit misleading, particularly when you're negotiating. I would just think of it as they're remissing your tuition, and maybe they can remiss it some more. But here's where it gets interesting. Law schools are essentially going to have to do a few things. I can't say it's going to be this year or next or the following, but they're going to have to stop giving out so much scholarship money. That's bad news for you all. But I don't think that's going to happen this cycle, believe it or not, because I think they're still stuck in this rankings carousel. They are going to have to increase their class sizes. I don't care what they're saying publicly. Now, someone's going to say, well, does that mean Harvard will increase their class sizes? I don't know the answer to any individual school. But the majority of law schools are going to be increasing their class sizes. At some point, they're going to be cutting back on how much merit aid they give. And a large subset of law schools, I would predict, now I'm just guessing, but maybe from 50 to past, are going to have to stop playing the rankings game. You'll get less scholarship money maybe, but in every other metric, the foundation will be more student-centric and less ranking-centric. The reason for this is because universities, by and large, are in an incredibly bad way financially. Moody's keeps downgrading them. They have the demographic cliff coming up, which means that they're about to lose a third of their enrollment. I think there's a Harvard Business School professor that predicted something like 50% of colleges and universities would go out of business. This would be not a good time to start a college or a university, right? So there won't be a Spivey college, I can guarantee it. So because universities are struggling so much financially, law schools don't get anything from them anymore. In fact, it's the opposite. I think universities are turning to law schools and saying, we need money from you. So what does that mean? It's speculation on when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen. That law schools will either go out of business or they will increase their class sizes and stop playing the rankings game. There was something I said in that misconception that leads me to my last misconception, which is also, I think, important, and I'll be delicate with my words. I've seen over the last 20 years of my career, I guess it's more than 20 years now, there's a subset of applicants that will believe anything a law school says. And I think there's a couple of things going on here. One, it comes from an authority figure. But the bigger one is, as an applicant, in your mind, you're selling yourself to the law school. You never think about the reverse direction. The law school is selling itself to you. I have a folder inbox of lies that law schools have said. If my firm ever just blows up, I'll just write a book of those emails, because some of the things I have heard schools say are unbelievably false. Now, some of my best friends in the world are deans of admissions at law schools. I am certainly not besmirching every law school. I'm certainly not besmirching anyone in particular. But what I am saying is everyone has an angle in the professional world, including Spivey Consulting, right? We want to get our information out there. So I do podcasts like this so that we can get information out there. That's the most transparent thing I can possibly say. I wish law schools would transparently say, what their angles are. And they don't. And they have them. So if someone on the message board says, well, this law school says they're not increasing their class size, or this law school says that they treat softs as a third of the application process, just please take it, as one data point. But don't take it as gospel word that must be true. It's just a word of caution. You wouldn't buy a car from someone and believe every word they told you, right? I actually had a dealer try to sell me a car once, and he was just so over the top. This car will do this, and women will love you, and blah, blah, blah. And I just walked out of there. It was just too embarrassing for him to be that cheesy. I think sometimes law schools are a little bit over the top with their messaging, but because they're law schools, applicants excuse the overtopness and almost embrace the message. So be careful. That's the final piece of advice. And again, they're not necessarily misconceptions. They're just things I think the market needs to be aware of. I hope this was helpful. This was Mike Spivey.